Let me turn the mic on. Hi, everybody. Well, so thank you for joining me for my little fanfic read tonight. I will be reading the first half of a Superman fanfic story that I have written. I'm going to read half tonight, and then I'm going to read half a week from tonight. And the reason being that the story is a little long. It's 43 pages, single spaced. I'm not usually the type of guy to brag about my length, but it is what it is. Um, so I timed it out. The first half that I'm going to read tonight takes about 45 minutes or so to read, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. It just depends on what the pace is. So I'll read the first half tonight, read the second half next week, and after I read the first half tonight, we can hang out in the live chat for a bit and talk about it or talk about whatever else you folks want to talk about. But I believe I shall, if there are no objections from the peanut gallery, I believe I shall get started and read the first half of my Superman story. Duralta Trekkie says, "How long did it take me to write it?" Well, okay, I'll answer that question real quick at the top here, and then I'll jump into the story. Um, in terms of actual hours of writing, it probably took maybe a week, something like that. But I started it back in September, and I wrote the first couple of scenes, and then I just kind of set it down and didn't even look at it for months. And then I think it was a combination of some random geek asking about it occasionally. And then Dana also sort of, poking me about it and going, "Hey, what about, when are you going to read another fic? When are you going to read another fic?" So I eventually went back to it just a couple weeks ago, and that was just the right time. You know what I mean? Like the muse was perched on my shoulder for whatever reason, and it just sort of poured out of me, and I finished it. So yeah, over the course of about 6 months, about a week of actual writing stretched out over about 6 months. So that's how long it took to write. So anyway, here we go. The story is it's a Superman story, and it takes place. Yes, Dana, lesson learned: be a pest. um, it takes place relatively early in Superman's career, maybe first couple years of his Supermanness. And for those of you who are wondering, because Dana and I have occasionally talked about our fanfic universe, this story is designed to take place in Dana and my fanfic universe, our little version of DC Comics universe. So here we go. Superman fanfic story, and this one is titled "Two Figures on a Riverbank." Here we go. It was a hot, dry Saturday morning at the end of the first week of June, and when Jonathan found him working in the barn, Clark had obviously been up for a few hours. "Getting an early start on it, eh?" he asked as he approached the workbench in the back corner where Clark was sanding a 2x2 piece of wood about 2.5 feet long, by Jonathan's guess. Clark straightened up. He'd really been putting his shoulder into it and was nearly done. Piled up along the wall at the back of the bench were 3 identical pieces of wood, all sanded smooth. "Hey, Pa," he said, grinning. He tossed the sandpaper he'd been working with onto the bench. "Yeah, thought if I finished early, I could go spend the day in town with Pete and Lana." Jonathan nodded approvingly. "But not before you got in a little light carpentry?" "Sun's only been up for an hour or so," Clark said with a shrug. "I doubt Pete or Lana are even awake yet. Wanted to keep busy after I got the chores done, excuse me." "Correct me if I'm wrong," Jonathan said, glancing at the sanded boards on the bench, "but you'd be making that side table your mother said she wanted for the kitchen?" "She's always saying how she never has enough counter space," Clark said, grinning as he reached for a fresh piece of sandpaper. "Uh-huh," said Jonathan. "She is at that." He glanced over his shoulder toward the front of the barn. "And out front, as I was walking in, I noticed you went ahead and changed that flat tire on the tractor, too." "Yep," said Clark, getting back to sanding. "Sure did." I was planning on taking care of that myself this morning. Matter of fact, it's what I came out here to do. Clark shrugged. I remembered it needed done, so I figured I'd save you the trouble. Only took me a couple of minutes. Jonathan slipped his hands into his pockets. He watched his son sand down the future table leg for a bit. I'm much obliged, he said, his voice trailing up. Clark showed a modest smile, then returned his attention to his work. Son, said Jonathan with a chuckle, is there something you want to ask me? About what? Clark asked over the sound of the sandpaper scratching against the wood. Jonathan lifted the flap on the front pocket of his shirt and reached in, removing a folded sheet of yellow paper. Clark stopped sanding as soon as he saw it. About this permission form I found on the kitchen table to play football at school next year, Jonathan said as he unfolded the paper. Clark put down the sandpaper. He slouched, slipping his palms into the back pockets of his dusty jeans. I don't think there'd be any harm in it, Pa. Jonathan smiled. Of course you don't. He turned his gaze to the form he held in both hands, and the smile faded. But it's not your signature they need on this, is it? No, sir, Clark answered quietly. Jonathan stared at the form. He breathed a heavy sigh. Clark, I don't know, he said, lifting his eyes to his son. I'd be careful, Clark said. I wouldn't hurt anybody. Jonathan furrowed his brow. He felt for a moment that he might start to cry. Heck, son, I know you wouldn't. I know it. But he turned his gaze back down to the paper. If you forgot, if you got carried away, even just one time, and people saw, if they saw the things you can do. Never mind, said Clark. He reached forward and snatched the permission form out of Jonathan's hand. I knew you'd say no, he said, brushing past Jonathan and stalking away toward the front of the barn. I don't know why I even bothered. Maybe someday, Clark, Jonathan called after him. Yeah? Clark hollered back, his voice shaking the particles of dust that hung in the dim morning light, though perhaps that was just Jonathan's imagination. When? Lois checked her phone, then dropped it into her bag with a heavy sigh. 10 minutes, she said, crossing her arms and glaring toward the empty lectern that had been set up outside the main entrance to the building, which housed the Metropolis Medical Examiner's office. She glanced around at her fellow reporters, most of whom also seemed to be growing restless. Then she turned to her immediate left to look at Clark, who was standing there with his hands in his pockets, a placid smile faintly perceptible on his face. Is this not annoying to you? Lois asked, narrowing her eyes at him. Clark shrugged. You don't expect them to get started right on the dot, do you? These things are always running a little behind. Are they? Lois arched an eyebrow and put her hands on her hips. So punctuality is not a small town value you picked up during your formative years in the corn belt? I think you mean the breadbasket, Clark said with a grin. And sure, punctuality is important, but everybody knows you always extend 15 minutes grace to people who are running late. Lois scowled. Why? It's only polite, Lois. Polite would be starting on schedule, she said, crossing her arms again, tighter this time. Neither one of us should have to be here, you know, she said. This is like sending Woodward and Bernstein to cover the opening of a supermarket. I think the autopsy findings on the death of Muggsy McElroy are of a little more interest to the public than a supermarket opening, said Clark. Lois snorted dismissively, as if we couldn't guess what they're going to say. How much do you want to bet they brought us all out here just to announce that it was supposedly an accident, or that the cause of death was inconclusive? I couldn't take that bet, Lois, said Clark, shaking his head at her. Gambling goes against the small-town values I learned as a boy in the Corn Belt. He squared his shoulders and faced front. Here they come, he said, pulling his phone out of his pocket and opening the voice recorder app. How do you know? Lois asked as she dug her phone back out of her messenger bag. A few seconds later, the front doors pushed open and the city medical examiner approached the lectern, accompanied by the spokesperson for the ME's office and a man in a lab coat who Lois assumed was who had actually performed the autopsy. The coat's a nice touch, Lois whispered, leaning toward Clark. But Clark didn't answer. Lois turned to him and noticed that he seemed distracted. He was holding up his phone to capture the audio of the press conference, but his weight was shifted to the right as though he were being pulled in that direction. What's with you? She asked. After a moment, Clark tucked his phone back into his pocket. I'll be right back, he said as he brushed by her and started off to the right. Lois watched him reach the end of the gathering of reporters and then turn and head toward the building. She waited until Clark disappeared around the corner, then put her phone away and turned to Kevin Garman of the Metropolis Star, who was standing a few feet to her right. Hey, she said, slapping him lightly on the arm. Remember last year when you dropped your digital recorder out of a helicopter and it hit that old lady on the head? Kevin's eyes darted around nervously. Yes, he said, his voice a harsh whisper. Remember how I didn't tell anyone it was you? Kevin nodded. Lois pointed at the digital recorder Kevin was holding up to capture the press conference. Email me a copy, she said. I gotta go. Kevin nodded again, but Lois was already gone, marching away to the right at a double step to catch up with Clark. She found him in the corridor inside the entrance on the west end of the building. He was standing at an intersection, peering around a corner. Whatever this is, Lois whispered, stepping lightly up behind him, it had better be worth missing the release of an irrelevant ME's report. Clark turned his head in Lois's direction and seemed about to speak, but before he could say anything, he was cut off by the anguished wail of somebody from around the corner. Lois stepped out from behind Clark and looked around the corner. At the far end of the corridor, standing in front of an observation window, was a woman in an expensive-looking leather jacket, hugging herself, nearly doubled over as she sobbed. Standing next to her was a young man who looked to be around 18 years old. On the other side of her was a woman who Lois recognized as Detective Maggie Sawyer. I'm sorry, Mrs. Horner, but I've got to ask you so there's no mistake, Detective Sawyer said softly. Is this your daughter, Philippa? Mrs. Horner nodded her head as more tears streamed down her cheeks. That's her, she said. That's my baby. She disintegrated into sobs once again, turning to the young man who embraced her tightly as she wept into his chest. I never would have let them do this, she cried, clutching at the back of the young man's shirt. If I'd known what was going to happen, I never would have said yes, never. I know, Mama, said the young man, stroking the back of her head. Sawyer patted Mrs. Horner on the shoulder. That's all I need for now, ma'am. You can go. Expect a call from me in a day or so, all right? Yes, Mrs. Horner whimpered as her son led her up the hall toward Lois and Clark. Thank you. Clark straightened up as Mrs. Horner and her son passed by. I'm so sorry for your loss, he said softly. Thank you, said Mrs. Horner, not looking up, dabbing at her eyes with a wad of tissue. Her son gave Clark a nod as they turned the corner and headed toward the door. Lois hesitated a moment as they passed, then took a step after them and said, Excuse me, ma'am, Mrs. Horner? I can't talk to anybody, Mrs. Horner said, leaning against her son, continuing on their way toward the door. Can you tell me how your daughter died? Lois asked. I might be able to help. Mrs. Horner stopped. She turned around to face Lois, the sorrow on her face gone, replaced by a look of seething anger. You can't help me, she said, pointing a finger at Lois. Nobody's helping me. I don't want no help. Leave me alone. She spun back around, put her arm around her son's waist, and continued down the hall and out the door at a quicker pace than before. Lois walked back over to Clark, who was glaring at her, his arms folded. What? She asked, holding out her arms. Maybe we could have helped her. Detective Sawyer came around the corner and walked past them. Detective Sawyer, said Clark, taking a step toward her, can you tell us anything about that? Sawyer stopped. She turned to face them. Tell you something about what? She asked curtly. A grieving mother identifying her dead child? I just told you all you need to know. Sawyer turned around and resumed her walk toward the door. Cause of death? Lois called after her. To be determined, answered Sawyer without turning around. Now go back to the press conference. She shoved open the door and left the building without breaking stride. Philippa Horner, Lois said as she watched the door swing shut on its pneumatic closer. Remember that name. There's something here. I can tell. Agreed, said Clark, but Sawyer's right. We'd better see if we can catch the end of that press conference. He started for the door. Lois took a few quick strides to catch up to him. How did you even know to come in here? She asked, cocking an eyebrow as she looked up at him. Clark said as they approached the door. I saw Detective Sawyer walking in. She looked like she was here for something important, so I decided to check it out. He pushed through the door and stood on the other side, holding it open. Makes sense, Lois said with a smirk as she walked out the door, past Clark, and down the sidewalk. Clark tried to focus on his computer screen as Lois continued tapping her pen impatiently against her desk. Finally, he gave up, let out a sigh, looked across his desk at her, and said, Something on your mind? She moaned absently. Another second went by. Then she turned to him as though unsure he'd even said anything. What? You're think-tapping, he said, glancing down at the pen in her hand. Oh, she put the pen down. Sorry, was that bothering you? She folded her hands in her lap and rolled her shoulders restlessly. Clark watched her for a moment, blinking calmly. Thinking about the woman from the morgue? What was that she said? Lois asked, leaning forward, folding her arms on the desk. Why did I say yes? I wouldn't have said yes if I had known what they were going to do. Clark nodded. Something like that. Say yes to what? To whatever caused her child's death, presumably. Well, obviously, Lois sighed restlessly. I looked up her address. She lives in Southside. How judgmental of me is it to jump to the conclusion that she shouldn't have been able to afford that leather jacket she was wearing? Clark narrowed his eyes and glanced aside as he considered it for a moment. A bit, he said, turning back to her. I bet you if we could just get a look at a bank statement, it would tell the whole story. Maybe, said Clark, leaning back in his chair. But I bet you that the police have already thought of that. Great idea. Lois reached across to Clark's desk, picked up the receiver of his phone, and threw it at him. It clattered against the blotter a few feet away, then slid over the edge and fell to the floor with a dull plastic smack. Clark just stared at it. Call Sawyer, Lois prompted impatiently. See if she'll let us look at Mrs. Horner's financial records. Clark bent over and fished the receiver up off the floor by the cord. You think she's more likely to honor our unreasonable request if it's coming from me? He asked, smirking as he pulled the base of the phone toward him. He cradled the phone between his head and shoulder and started to dial. What's unreasonable about it? Asked Lois. We're journalists wanting to stay informed about an investigation that may be of legitimate interest to the public. Ooh! She picked up her pen again and tapped it sharply twice against her desk. Say that! You're a genius, Clark deadpanned as he swiveled in his chair to lean one arm on the desk. A moment later, the line clicked as someone answered. Sawyer. Detective Sawyer, hello. This is Clark Kent from the Daily Planet. There was a pause. How can I help you, Mr. Kent? I was calling with some follow-up questions about Mrs. Horner from earlier this afternoon. Do you have a few minutes to talk? I don't think there's anything to talk about, said Sawyer with a tone of practiced patience. I made myself clear at the morgue. There's nothing more I can tell you. No, I understand, said Clark. Anything new regarding cause of death? Sawyer sighed into the phone. Mr. Kent, please don't make me repeat myself. If there's nothing else I can do for you, I'm hanging up the phone. I apologize, Detective, but no, I'm not asking you to repeat yourself. If you recall, at the morgue, you said you had told us all we needed to know, and then Miss Lane asked you about cause of death, and you said it was yet to be determined. I was just wondering if that's still the case. Sawyer was quiet for a second. Yes, that's still the case. All right, said Clark, turning his chair again to lean forward on the desk. Just wanted to check. Say, as long as I've got you on the phone, Miss Lane and I were doing a bit of speculating earlier, and we thought perhaps it might be worth taking a look at Mrs. Horner's financial records, bank statements, and so forth. I don't suppose that's an angle you've already been pursuing? Sawyer sighed again, sharper than before. Mr. Kent, you're asking for privileged information about an ongoing investigation. And while you might be a softer touch than your partner, it's not going to get you any farther than she would have gotten. Now, if that's all you needed, I really should get back to work. Nothing unusual on the bank statements then? Then, Clark asked quickly, sensing Sawyer's patience was nearly at an end. He found out a moment later how right he was. Goodbye, Mr. Kent, Sawyer said, and ended the call. Clark tapped the handset lightly against the side of his head, then hung it up. Well, it was worth a try anyway, Lois, he said, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms against his chest. Lois rolled her eyes. She pushed her chair back away from the desk and stood. You didn't say the thing, she said, grabbing her messenger bag by its strap and lifting it off the back of her chair. Journalists working in the legitimate interest of the public. That's the ticket. She started away from their desks. Where are you going? Said Clark, his brow furrowed. Lois turned back and shrugged. Mrs. Horner's place, she said, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. I'm going to go through her garbage. She turned back and continued her walk toward the elevators. Clark jumped up, grabbed his jacket, and jogged after her. In the legitimate interest of the public, of course, he said, catching up to her as she punched the down button. Which one of them would actually be picking through Mrs. Horner's garbage was the sole subject of conversation on the drive over. Eventually, they, meaning Lois, decided that she would search the garbage, while Clark served as lookout. This was the best approach, she explained, in a somewhat distant tone that suggested she was thinking out loud more to herself than speaking to Clark, because while she didn't look forward to being elbows deep in a trash can, she also didn't trust Clark to be able to identify a useful piece of evidence if he came across one. Clark assured her that he took no offense at this. Their, meaning Lois's, plan hit a snag when they arrived at the address where Mrs. Loretta Horner lived with her son Michael and, until recently, her daughter Philippa. It was a crumbling, neglected 3-story brick building with a narrow alley running along one side. Lois parked across the street and they walked down the alley to the back of the building. Next to the rear entrance stood a battered metal dumpster. A mound of filled black garbage bags rose up over the top of it. Great, Lois said. One dumpster for a whole building with however many apartments. 6, said Clark, studying the building. Lois turned and regarded him with a cocked eyebrow. I'm guessing, Clark added sheepishly. From the size, the number of windows. Lois nodded slowly. Okay, new plan, she said a few seconds later, staring at the dumpster with her hands on her hips. We're both on garbage duty until we find some that belongs to Mrs. Horner. Then you stand watch while I do investigative journalism, Clark offered, not even attempting to hold back a smirk. Lois shot him a glare, then gestured sharply for him to get in the dumpster. Clark considered allowing her to root through the garbage for a few minutes before discovering the bag containing some of Mrs. Horner's discarded mail he had already located using his X-ray vision. Instead, he sighed, climbed into the dumpster, found that bag, and pulled it up right away. Lois was just about to throw her leg over the side and step into the pile of garbage when Clark turned to her, the bag he'd just excavated open in front of him, and said, "Jackpot." Lois stared in disbelief. What? You've got to be kidding. Nope, said Clark, glancing down at the bag. I don't think so. Looks like this one has a bunch of mail addressed to Mrs. Horner. Anything from the bank? Asked Lois. Maybe, Clark said, tilting his head inquisitively as he retied the bag. But I really think we should stick to the plan. He tossed the bag toward Lois. It landed atop the pile a foot or so in front of her. If I go through it, I'm liable to miss something. He flashed her a smile as he climbed out of the dumpster and strolled around to the corner of the building. Lois glowered at him over her shoulder, then turned back around and pulled the bag open. Just let me know if anyone's coming. I'm on it, said Clark cheerfully, leaning forward to peer up the alley toward the street. Take your time. Clark's head snapped toward a sound from the second floor of the apartment building. He narrowed his eyes, peering through the wall, to see Mrs. Horner locking her front door, then heading toward the stairs at the end of the hall. In her right hand was a garbage bag. Someone's coming, he said. Ha ha, very funny, Lois said flatly as she pulled a stack of torn envelopes out of the bag and began to sort through them. No, Lois, I'm serious, Clark said, his voice rising as he watched Mrs. Horner descend the stairs. Mrs. Horner just left her apartment, and I think she's heading this way. We should go, or hide, or something. Lois rolled her eyes. You really are bad at this. You know, I can see right through you, right? She shoved the envelope she'd been looking at back into the bag and plunged in for another stack. I'm sure you can, said Clark, taking several steps toward Lois, eyes still fixed on Mrs. Horner as she reached the landing halfway down the staircase. But trust me, you need to get down off that dumpster now. This is it, Lois said, pulling a paper from the top envelope of the stack in her hand. Her bank statement from last month. Fantastic, said Clark, grabbing her firmly by the waist and pulling her down. Hey! I'm sorry, Lois, but there's no time, he said as he took her hand and pulled her around the corner. They were about to round the corner and start up the alley. As they were about to round up the corner and start up the alley, something at the rear entrance caught Clark's eye, and he froze for a moment. Lois moved on ahead, and this time it was her tugging him by the hand, pulling him out of sight, just as the back door swung open and Mrs. Horner stepped outside. How'd you know she was coming? Lois whispered as they rushed along the side of the building toward the street. I heard a door slam from inside, Clark said. I didn't want to take any chances. I didn't hear anything, said Lois. Your ears must be better than your eyes because I didn't see any. Oof! Lois had just walked into someone as that someone turned the corner from the sidewalk into the alley. She took a step back and realized it was Michael Horner. He stood there, eyeing Lois and Clark suspiciously. You're those reporters from the morgue, he said. What are you doing here? We hoped we could speak to your mother, Lois said, casually moving her hands, one of which held the bank statement she dug out of the garbage, behind her back. But I don't think she was home. No one answered the door. What's that? Michael asked. Lois cocked her head to the side innocently. What's what? What's that behind your back? Not waiting for her to answer, Michael stepped toward Lois, reached around behind her, and snatched the envelope out of her hand. Easy, son, said Clark, calmly holding up his hands, palms out. We're not here to hurt your mom or you. I'm not your son, said Michael, scowling at Clark. He scanned the envelope, then flashed Lois an angry glare. You went through our garbage? He turned and started down the alley, shaking his head in disbelief. We just want to help you, Lois called after him. And your mom. You keep away from me and my mom, Michael yelled back. He tore the envelope to pieces as he reached the rear of the building and disappeared around the corner. Lois's shoulders sagged. God damn it. She turned and walked to the curb. I didn't even get a look at the bank statement. She watched for traffic and, seeing none, started across the street. There was nothing useful, said Clark, following behind her. A couple of large deposits, but they were cash, nothing we could trace. Lois reached the car door and stared at him as he walked around to the passenger side. He shrugged at her from across the roof of the car. I snuck a peek while you were holding it behind your back. He tugged at the door handle. Can you unlock me on this side? Sure. She unlocked the car and they climbed inside. So, what was that back there? Lois asked as she pulled her seatbelt across herself and snapped it in place. When you froze for a second. Oh, that? Said Clark. He looked straight out the front windshield and shook his head. That was nothing. He kept staring out the window as Lois pulled out of the parking space, but his mind wasn't on the road. It was on the cast iron railing that ran along the steps at the rear entrance of Loretta Horner's apartment building, and the section of that railing that had been crushed like an aluminum can in someone's fist. Martha burst through the screen door and ran down the back stoop to find Clark standing in the yard halfway to the edge of the cornfield, his back to the house. When he turned around, she saw he was holding a basketball. Or it had been a basketball, at least. Now it was totally flat, hanging limp in his hands, a large rip in its surface where the air had blown out. "Oh, good Lord, Clark," she said, holding her hand to her chest. "I heard that bang and thought a gun went off." "Sorry, Ma," said Clark, dropping the basketball. "Didn't mean to scare you." He reached down and plucked a football from the ground near his feet. "This one probably won't be as bad." He pressed the football between his palms, flattening it with a loud, sharp pop. "Yeah. See?" He tossed it aside. As Martha approached, she noticed other mangled pieces of sports equipment strewn over the ground where Clark was standing. A baseball crushed to a nearly unrecognizable tangle of yarn and torn leather, a twisted tennis racket and several cans worth of exploded tennis balls, a flattened soccer ball, the torn shreds of an infielder's mitt, and an aluminum baseball bat with a barrel that had been crushed in what Martha knew was her son's own hand. She stood beside him and nudged him with her shoulder. "I take it this means you've decided to forsake all other sports and make your old mother's dream come true by becoming a rodeo cowboy?" Clark chuckled bitterly. He looked out across the cornfield, which stretched as far as most other people could see, and shook his head. "Nah," he said. "I'm sure me doing that would be just as embarrassing to Pa if I played football." Martha put her hand on Clark's shoulder. "Son, look here." Clark turned his head toward her. "Whatever you think of your father," she said, "whatever you think his reasons are for not wanting you to play, you have to know one thing, that it has nothing to do with him or me being embarrassed about you." "Ma," Clark whined, pulling away from her. "It's nice of you to say that, but it's no good. Earlier in the barn, he as good as said that's what it is." Martha cocked her head to the side skeptically. "What does that mean, he as good as said it? What did he say?" "He said if I get carried away, if I forget to hold back even one time, and people see what I can do, it would..." Clark turned away. He looked at the ground. "It wouldn't look good on him." Martha lowered her gaze, peered at Clark from beneath her brow. "Is that what he said?" "It's what he meant." She shook her head, frowning sympathetically. "No, Clark, that's not what he meant." "Ma," Clark began, obviously irritated, but Martha cut him off before he could get another word out. "No," she said in a firm, empathetic tone that indicated to Clark that what she was about to tell him was not to be argued with. "It's not about you. And it's not about us. It's about the way people get treated in this world when they turn out to be different." Clark turned away again in frustration. "How is having to keep it secret any better than being treated like a freak?" "I don't know," Martha said. "I don't know. Am I just supposed to hide who I really am from everyone for the rest of my life?" "No," said Martha, shaking her head vehemently. "Lord, no. Clark, ever since we realized what you can do, how you're different, your father and I have known that one day you would use those abilities to do something, I don't know, something important, something that helps people. We've always known you couldn't and shouldn't stay our secret forever. I don't know how or why you can do what you can do, but I know there must be a reason. Clark snorted bitterly. It's just not to score touchdowns. Martha moved closer. She reached out and rubbed his back gently. After a moment, he leaned into her, and she embraced him. I don't know, son, she whispered. I don't know. Morning, Clark said cordially, placing a cup of coffee in front of Lois as he passed her desk. He walked around to his desk, put his coffee down, and shrugged off his jacket. Still thinking about Mrs. Horner? Thanks, said Lois, picking up the coffee Clark had brought her. Yeah. She peeled off the lid and took a sip. Did you put that hazelnut creamer in this? She asked, frowning at the cup. Oh! Whoops. Clark reached over and took the cup from Lois. Sorry, that's mine. He passed her the other coffee. I mixed them up. That one should be black and bitter, just how you like it. Lois removed the lid and took a sip. She smiled and let out a long, satisfied sigh. Like drinking a black hole, she said. Should we talk to someone from the ME's office about the McElroy autopsy findings? Asked Clark as he sat down, in case Perry wants a follow-up on that for tomorrow's edition. Ugh, Lois rolled her eyes. I suppose. She put down the coffee cup, leaned forward, and drummed her fingers on her desk. There's no story there. This Horner thing, that's something. If only we could get somewhere with it. Clark sipped his coffee. Well, I'm open to suggestions. Lois thought a moment and shrugged. We could go harass the grieving mother some more. I think you've done enough of that. The voice belonged to Detective Sawyer, approaching their desks from the elevators. Clark moved to stand up, but Sawyer waved him off. No, she said, and Clark remained seated. She turned to Lois. I got a call from Michael Horner this morning. The son of the grieving mother you've been harassing? Lois leaned back in her chair and looked up at Sawyer. Did you? He says he ran into you two outside his building yesterday. He said it looked like you two had been going through their garbage. Lois shrugged. I can see how he might have come to that conclusion. Sawyer crossed her arms and looked down at Lois. I told you. She turned to Clark. I told both of you. There's nothing about Philippa Horner you need to know. No reason to talk to her mother, no reason to see her mother, no reason to go to her house. I realize your dealings with Henderson may have given you an unrealistic expectation as to how much access to active investigations you'll be given, but this isn't Henderson's case. This is my case. I'm not Henderson. She turned back to Lois. And you are not cops. Do we have an understanding? Oh, I think we definitely understand each other, said Lois, gazing calmly up at Sawyer. Good. Sawyer turned and left. Can you believe her? Lois said, leaning forward on her desk. Where does she think she works? Corto Maltese? Why was she mostly yelling at me? Clark wondered, shaking his head. That didn't seem fair. Oh, hush. Lois threw a paperclip at him. She went on to say something else a moment later, but by then Clark wasn't paying attention. He'd been distracted by the sound of Detective Sawyer answering her cell phone as the elevator started down. This is Sawyer, she said. Detective, this is Sergeant Gibson. You're needed at the ME's office. Philippa Horner's body just came up missing. What? Sawyer yelled into her phone, startling the others on the elevator with her. I'll be right there. She ended the call. Clark pulled out his phone and stood up. Lois, I have to go, he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair and starting toward the stairs. Go? Lois asked, starting to follow him. Where? He held up his phone. Just got a text from a confidential source. I need to go meet him. A confidential source about what? Lois demanded. The McElroy autopsy. He says the ME left off something important and he wanted the public to know about it. Lois grabbed her messenger bag. Well, Jesus, don't go running off without me. No, said Clark, pulling on his jacket as he backed toward the stairs. I have to meet with him alone. This source, he said he'll only talk to me. He hates women. Oh, really? Lois glared at him as he bumped against the door to the stairwell. Is that all you two have in common? Lois, I really have to go, Clark stammered as he pushed open the door. If he tells me anything important, I'll share it with you, of course, but it might be nothing. Who knows? He shoved through into the stairwell. Why are you taking the stairs instead of the elevator? Lois yelled after him. It's good for my circulation, Clark hollered back, his voice fading down into silence. Well, I'll be damned if I'm just going to stick around and wait for him to get back, Lois muttered as she slung her messenger bag over her shoulder and started toward the door through which Clark had just exited. She raced down the stairs, hoping to catch him, but by the time she reached the lobby of the planet, he was gone. She walked outside and looked for him up and down the sidewalk, but there was no sign of him. Who gets a cab that quick? She asked herself as she walked back inside and headed toward the garage. And that is where I'm going to stop for the week. That is about halfway through the story. So I will read the second half next Thursday, but that's the first half of the story. So yeah, thoughts, like, dislike. What do you think's going to happen? Technically, no Superman in the first half. Although, not in his costume, but, I think you can tell that that's sort of the direction that things are going. But, yeah. So. Thank you, beautifulest one. I'm glad you like it. More! I will say I'm really looking forward to reading the second half next week. I think the second half is really strong as well. And when he actually does appear as Superman, I think it's going to be. I think you'll enjoy that too if you enjoyed the first half. Radical Bacon, how sweet does Superman take his coffee? I don't really know. I thought it would be. I wanted to do sort of a bumbling Clark Kent gag there, but not be too over the top about it. So he doesn't do anything too comical. He doesn't like bump into anything or make a mess or whatever. But he just he gets the coffee order wrong. Like he mixes up the coffees, and you can interpret that as he did that on purpose as a bumbling Clark thing, or he genuinely just mixed them up because Superman's not perfect. Either way, I think it works. But yeah, Clark takes, he at least that morning, he wanted hazelnut creamer in his coffee. So maybe he does take it kind of sweet. Yeah. Thank you, Broken Back Tango. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Oh, and thank you, Der Alta Trekkie. Dalton Trekkie says, I play Clark and Lois really good. Well, I try to write them. I try to get their voices right, and that's really most of it. I mean, if you're a decent reader and you write the characters with, a unique voice, and really all you have to do, or at least all I have to do, is just read them the way I wrote them. You know what I mean? Radical Bacon Clark is as corny as Kansas in August. I think Clark, I mean, the way I write him, I see the way I write Clark for this story, and I don't know if necessarily, Dorota Trekkie, yeah, they don't, they come together thematically. Hopefully that makes sense when I read the second half. The Clark, the flashbacks of Clark, and then the modern day story come together sort of thematically. So hopefully that makes sense when the rest of the story is read. But yeah, well, when I was writing them for this, Clark, when I write Lois and when I imagine Lois, it's almost always Margot Kidder from the Superman movies. And Clark, it depends on the story. Sometimes I'm going for more of like a laid back sort of Dean Cain Clark from Lois and Clark. But for this story, I felt like his voice, especially in some of the more sort of humorous moments when he's bantering with Lois, he's sort of like a more laid back version of the Christopher Reeve version of Clark. He's not quite as much of a cartoon. He's not nearly as much of a cartoon actually as Christopher Reeve's version of Clark is, but it's that sort of personality, you know. He's talks a little fast. There's sort of a little bit of snap to their banter. He's ever so slightly kind of naive, but at the same time, he's smart enough to know when Lois is messing with him. Um, yeah, but I think there's a couple of exchanges between them in the second half that I feel like I was really sort of channeling like a sort of a loosened up Christopher Reeve Clark for the voice. So, well, and Radical Bacon, like how smart is he? I mean, there's the old theme song that describes him as having well the old Superman theme song. I think from one of the 1960s cartoons is where it comes from, but it's from another planet, muscles made of granite, X-ray eyes, and super brain. So if we go by that, Superman is pretty smart. I don't think he's like genius level, but I think he's pretty smart. Oh, thank you, beautifulest one, very much for the super chat. It says another brilliant work of art, my friend Bravo. Thank you so. That means a lot. Thank you so much for saying that. I really appreciate that. Um, yeah, Geralta Trekkie. I guess I can sort of see how he might have been a little bit like Tom Welling from Smallville in the flashbacks. That's not really what I was thinking consciously. Um, I was kind of thinking like a younger version of young Clark from Superman the movie. You know what I mean? Like for like the high school Clark that we see in Superman the movie. Um, I was kind of thinking of that only maybe like 3 or 4 years before that. But that kind of personality, you know. But yeah, I think it works with like the Tom Welling Clark from Smallville as well for sure. Um, Oh, thank you, Steve George. I am one of the better writing Steves. Thank you very much. Dana asks, who is kinder, Clark or Stuffy? Ooh, that's a tough one. Probably Stuffy. Probably Stuffy because Stuffy has to put up with me. Clark, I mean, I don't think Lois is quite as much to put up with as I would be, especially like the Stuffy and Friends version of me. So I think Stuffy has to practice kindness more often at a higher degree. you know. But Radical Bacon, you are just killing it with the puns tonight, my friend. You may think Superman is kind, but German children are always kinder. I like that. Oh, that's a good one. Um, that's a really good one. Uh, Geralta Trekkie says Lois and Clark was an amazing show. Sad to see Dean Cain to slip. And I like Tyler Hoechlin's Soups Clark in the Supergirl show. Yes. Oh my God. Speaking of Tyler Hoechlin's Superman and Clark, I'm not going to spoil anything in case people have not seen it and want to see it. But the premiere of Superman and Lois was this week. It was Tuesday night, and I watched it yesterday because I watch it next day streaming because I watch live TV uh, through Sling, and my Sling package doesn't include a Sling package sounds filthy, by the way, doesn't it? My Sling package doesn't include a CW station, so I watched it streaming the next day, and whoa, boy, the pilot episode of Superman and Lois was just outstanding. I absolutely loved it, and really cool to see Tyler Hoechlin's Superman and Bitsy Tulloch's Lois get their own show, and so far so good. It's just we're one episode in, so it's it could get a lot better, it could get a lot worse, it could stay about the same. But the pilot episode, it was a really strong pilot episode, and yeah, Tyler Hoechlin's Superman is just wonderful. And if you want to get a good sort of idea of what at least as far as how his Superman is in the show, because the show is about, it's about, you know, him as Superman, but also it's about him and Lois raising their kids, and there's a situation in Smallville that they get involved with, and I'm not going to like go into detail in case I spoil anything, but there's an opening sort of a prologue that kind of catches you up as to, you know, how this version of Superman's life has gone so far. And you know, you see like a really brief recap of, you know, like the ship landing in Kansas and his parents finding him, and what happens to, you know, him as a teenager, and then he gets to Metropolis, and we get to see him, like just a really brief scene of him in his early days as Superman. And the clip they put the clip on YouTube, so if you can find the clip of I think it's on, it's called like Superman meets Lois or something, because it also includes the scene where Clark and Lois meet each other at the Daily Planet for the first time. But before that, there's a scene of Superman uh, saving a little boy's life when there's a car like falls off a bridge, and Superman flies in and catches the car. And there's like a cool little recreation of the cover of Action Comics #1, where he's like sitting the car down, and he's dressed in his Superman suit in that one scene, because it's early in his career. His Superman suit is the design is based on the Fleischer brothers Superman, with the black background for the S and the yellow sort of outline, and like the black belt. And oh, it looks amazing. It's so cool to see like that suit, like the Fleischer brothers Superman suit in live action. It's awesome. And the wind from him flying by knocks the kid's hat off. The kid has a baseball cap on and knocks the kid's hat off. And Superman he puts the car down, sets it down safely, walks up to the kid, picks up his hat along the way, gives the kid his hat back, says, "Here you go, friend." And the kid just kind of looks at him in amazement and says, "Cool costume." And Superman smiles and says, "Thanks. My mom made it for me." And he takes off, and the force of him taking off knocks the kid's hat off again. And oh, it's just so perfect. Like if you want to get a sense of why this particular version of Superman, the Tyler Hoechlin Supergirl DC Arrowverse version of Superman, that is at the center of this new show, why that's just such a wonderful version of the character, and why those of us who really like that Superman like him so much. That scene is a great summary of it, because he gets everything right. He gets everything right. He's such a great Superman. Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much for the super chat. Oh, and it's got like a little flying sticker on it too. I appreciate that. Dana asks, how does Tyler's soup stack up compared to my other faves? Okay, so it's tough to rank him. I mean, he's somewhere below Christopher Reeve. Christopher Reeve is still the gold standard for Superman. I think at this point I might have to rank him above Brandon Routh, just because Brandon only got one movie and then a couple of scenes in the Arrowverse Crisis crossover, right? And he was great. Like Brandon Routh, my God, if anybody was ever born to play Superman, it was Brandon Routh. And I really wish that he would have had the opportunity to play Superman more than he has, because I thought he was great in Superman Returns, and I thought he was just as great in his role as Superman in the Arrowverse Crisis on Infinite Earths. I thought he just did so well. He was spectacular. And I mean, God, just look at the guy. He was born to play Superman. I don't understand why he wasn't. You know, it's like your job for the rest of your life is playing Superman. You will play Superman. Like he's perfect for it. But he's only played Superman a couple of times, whereas Tyler Hoechlin has now played Superman in multiple episodes of Supergirl, including appearances in. He also played another, you know, his version of Superman in the Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover, and now he has his own show with Bitsy Tulloch as Lois. And so I think I've seen enough of him now, and that take on the character has been established clearly enough, and his sort of contribution to it has been established enough that I think I kind of have to rank him above Brandon, even though I love Brandon Routh as Superman. I think I have to rank Tyler above that. So he might be second place. I really love Dean Cain as Superman 2 from Lois and Clark. I think Lois and Clark was a great show, and I thought Dean Cain's Superman was excellent and was sort of it was cool to see it at the time that the show was on because it was very specifically inspired by the Superman in the comics that were being written at that time. He was very, very, very clearly based on the post crisis sort of John Byrne, Man of Steel version of Superman. And that was really, really cool to see as someone who was reading comics in the 90s to see like a live action Superman who was obviously inspired by what was the current Superman in the comics. And Dean Cain was a great Superman. Dean Cain as a human being in real life is a sack of garbage, but back in the 90s when he was playing Clark and Superman, he was terrific. So he's way up there, but I don't know, I kind of Tyler's Superman is so good and is so close to like my ideal version of the character, like in terms of his temperament and his personality. And I think at this point I would put him second to Christopher Reeve. He ranks really high. He's really good, and it's not just him. I mean, it's him, and it's also the way the character is written. Um, yeah, he's way up there. He's way up there. He's really good. He's really good. Yeah, Duralta Trekkie. Yeah, Brandon is great as Ray Palmer for sure. Um, Radical Bacon says Henry Cavill should stick to Witchering, which is a show I've never watched and I'm not that interested in. Well, the thing about here's the thing, right? Um, I think if Henry Cavill got to play Superman in a proper movie that was not written and directed or conceived and directed by an Ayn Rand worshiping psychopath, then I think he would probably be a really good Superman. I think Henry Cavill is a fine actor. He definitely looks the part. And I think if he were cast as Superman in a movie made by someone who did not hate Superman, then he would probably be a pretty good Superman. Unfortunately, it was his fate to have to play Superman in movies directed by Zack Snyder. So his Superman is garbage, but it's not really his fault. He's playing the role that was written and appearing in the movie and playing a role in the movie directed by Zack Snyder. So his Superman is awful. His Superman is easily the worst live action Superman that I think there's ever been. I mean, he's terrible. He's just terrible. But it's not Henry Cavill's fault, you know. I mean, he didn't write the script. He didn't direct the movie. He's just playing the role. So, oh, Dottie Pie says, "Did you know that Superman 2 was filmed right behind my parents' place in Morley, Alberta, Canada?" I did not know that. That's really cool. That's really cool. I just watched Superman 2 about a week ago. I felt like watching a Superman movie, and you know, Superman 2 is one of my it's one of my favorite superhero movies in general, Superman or not. And I watched it, and um, I love Superman 2. So that's really cool that it was filmed near your house or near your mom's house. Yeah, yeah, Dana, exactly. He's not terrible. The character is written as terrible. Yeah, exactly. And and yeah, there are people I know that like a lot of us who were really, really happy with how the pilot of Superman and Lois was were sort of singing the praises of that version of Superman. And I've sung the praises of Tyler Hoechlin's Superman all along from the first time I saw him in Supergirl. I thought, oh, that's it. That's how you do it. And you can't help but compare that. I mean, you can help it, but it's why would you want to help it? It's an obvious comparison to make. There are two high profile live action Supermans at the moment. There's the Tyler Hoechlin version on TV, and there's the Henry Cavill version in the movies. And the Tyler Hoechlin version gets everything right, and the Henry Cavill version gets everything wrong. So, like, yeah, in my opinion, it's subjective, but in my opinion, gets everything wrong. So it's only natural to compare the two. And yeah, there are people on Twitter who were like, oh, the Arrowverse Superman is weak, and the Arrowverse Superman is corny, and the Arrowverse Superman is an embarrassment, blah blah blah. You know, and it's one of those things that they're speaking a language I don't understand. You know what I mean? Like I grew up in the 80s and the 90s watching Christopher Reeve's Superman in the movies, watching John Hames Newton and Gerard Christopher play Superboy in the Superboy TV series, watching Dean Cain play Superman on Lois and Clark, watching Superman the animated series, um, in addition to reading the comics and stuff. And that's the super, and from all of that, and watching like the old George Reeves show, which I absolutely love, and of course the Fleischer Brothers cartoons, which might be my favorite adaptation of Superman. Period. I cannot overemphasize how much I love the Fleischer Brothers cartoons, and all through all of that, right? And I never got the impression that the most interesting thing about the character was that he was really strong and he punched things. Like, so when Superman Returns came out in '06, I think, and people complained about that movie, and one of their complaints was, well, he doesn't punch anybody. I just didn't understand that. It's not just that I disagreed. I didn't understand where the expectation even came from. Like, the fact that he punches people sometimes has got to be the least interesting thing about him. And I know there were a lot of, and the 90s comics, there was a lot of action oriented stuff. I mean, there was a period in the 90s where it seemed like the Superman comics, it was just one superpowered, like muscle bound alien villain after another. And that got I thought that was kind of boring, because I was sort of raised on the Christopher Reeve Superman, where, yeah, he did fight superpowered villains every once in a while. He did have the fight with General Zod and Non and Ursa in Superman 2, and he did fight Nuclear Man in Superman 4. But, I mean, it's not like you were watching the movie hoping you would get to see Superman punch somebody. Like, that's not what makes Superman Superman. Even the George Reeves Superman, who would occasionally knock out a crook, because they were sort of like little crime dramas, because it was the 50s and they had no budget, and it was Superman versus gangsters and robbers mostly. But, he would occasionally, like, punch somebody to knock him out. But it's not like you were watching the movie or watching the TV show going, oh, I hope I get to see Superman punch somebody this time. If anything, you were hoping you got to see him burst through a wall. Like, that was the cool Superman thing that he did in the show, is he would burst through the wall, and he was usually doing it so he could save Jimmy, or save Lois. Like, he was saving people. He wasn't doing it to hurt people. He was doing it to help people. So people who are like into the Zack Snyder version of Superman because he's so badass and he's such a, there's so much action, and he fights people and beats people up, and he's like this. I don't understand that. I just don't understand that. It's not a language I'm familiar with. Dana asks, do you think that's why Zack Snyder has a job? Because today's young adults grew up with the grim, dark stuff. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, obviously, the audience had to come from somewhere, right? I mean, people didn't just, come out of the womb and instantly want to see a dark, violent Superman. I mean, that expectation had to be created somehow. So yeah, maybe. But even, I mean, I don't think even in the 90s, like Superman was never as dark and grim as he has been in the Snyder movies. Like, I don't ever remember a mainstream. There you can cite like Elseworld stories and sort of one shots and stuff like that, but in terms of like the mainstream comic book version of Superman, like even in the 90s when it was way more action oriented and there was a lot more sort of, angst being put on the character, where his death and resurrection, and it seemed like every month there was a new superpowered strong alien guy coming to beat him up. Like, even in that era, I don't remember it being nearly as dark as the Snyder version. And I don't ever remember Superman having the sort of sullen chip on his shoulder attitude about being Superman that Snyder's version of the character has, which is one of the most off-putting things about that version of the character, is that he seems like he resents even having to be Superman, you know, which just doesn't, again, I don't understand why anybody would think that version of the character is appealing, you know. Yeah, Danny, yeah, other characters, yeah, yeah, maybe. And yeah, there is sort of, I know there is like, there is an attitude among a lot of fans, and unfortunately a lot of writers, that, you know, Superman is tough to write because he's not a dark enough character. And there may be you know, there's sort of a, what I think is like a really, really misguided sort of conventional wisdom among those types of fans, that the way to fix Superman is to make him darker and more angsty and grimmer and more conflicted and more violent. And, you know, I don't, I think that's just as silly as when they tried to do that with Spider-Man. Like, that's not who Spider-Man is either. And Spider-Man, even, I mean, Spider-Man, classic Spider-Man is way more angsty and fraught than Superman usually is. But even then, he's not like a depressing, brooding, angry character. But they did the same thing to Spidey in the 90s. They tried to turn everybody into Batman. You know, like the dark, brooding version of Batman gained some traction. And for a while there, it seemed like, well, we got to make everybody into Batman. And yeah, so maybe Snyder's Superman is unfortunately sort of a belated product of that. I mean, the irony is, by the time Snyder's Superman came around, the comics had mostly moved on from that. The comics had gotten into more of sort of a throwback Silver Age thing. Like, think about like what the most acclaimed Superman comic of the century so far, right? And one of the most acclaimed Superman comics or superhero comics in general of any character was All Star Superman, right? I mean that's at the top of almost everybody's list now of like favorite Superman comic book stories. Like, it's legendary, and it deserves to be. It's a great book, and that is totally the opposite of the Zack Snyder take. It is a fun, inventive, bright, Silver Age like throwback story, and it has a vein of melancholy running through it. You know, it's not nothing. It's not just sunshine and rainbows. There is some sad, you know, depressing stuff that happens throughout the story, and the overall story is one that is kind of sad. But the tone is not. It's not grim and dark and angsty and violent, and, you know, it's completely the opposite. But here comes Zack Snyder, I guess, who stopped paying attention to the scene in, you know, the early to mid 90s when everybody was still, ooh, it's got to be dark, you know. And he's like, I know how to do Superman, and he does this version of Superman that is completely out of step with what the then current version of the Superman comics were, you know. Yes, don't forget the lollipops. Um, Dana, yes. Superman goes to Disneyland. I cannot wait for that. That is an upcoming story in Dana and my fanfic universe that is going to be awesome. I cannot wait. Um, and also, not just, I mean, that's a great example, like, of, you know, Superman goes to Disneyland is when it's actually written. That's going to be a great example of, like, you know, an antidote to grimdark Superman. But also, I mean, you know, I just mentioned All Star Superman. Superman for All Seasons is another great one. Um, Superman Smashes the Klan, which just came out a couple years ago, and I read it last year in the collected edition. Superman Smashes the Klan is awesome. Is a great story, great artwork. The artwork is very sort of Fleischer Brothers slash Superman animated series, like that sort of style, very sort of cartoon style. Great story. It's like a modern adaptation of the story from the old 1940s radio show, where Superman fights a thinly fictionalized uh, you know, version of the Ku Klux Klan. And that's what the story is. And it's socially relevant. It's really fun and creative and adventure-y, but deals with a really serious social topic. And it's just great. It's just great. And it's not dark. You know, it's great. It's a terrific Superman story. So that's another one that you could send people to, say, read this. Like this is the kind of Superman story that I grew to expect, you know, like when I was falling in love with the character as a kid. Well, see, Geralta Trekkie, actually, I think I'm going to yeah, it's Serenity. I don't like it when Superman gets political, right? So go back to the 40s and tell that to the people who made the Superman radio show in what, like, I think it was like 1946 or 48, something like that, when that episode aired on the radio. It was Superman versus the Ku Klux Klan, right? So go back to the 40s, in the earliest years of the character, when it was totally getting political, at least occasionally. You know, there was I mean, and Christ, they did World War II stories. Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman, the Justice Society, in the 1940s, during World War II, they totally did World War II stories. So, like, that strikes me as kind of political. Yes, also for propaganda purposes, of course, but that's political. But anyway, yeah, Duralta Trekkie, you mentioned the scene from Man of Steel where, Clark saves the school bus from the water, and then Paul is sort of upset with him, and he's like, "What should I have done? Let everybody drown?" And Paul says, "Maybe." Right? That is an oft-cited scene, an oft-cited example of where that movie goes wrong, and I don't disagree with that. But I feel like in a better movie, that scene could have worked. Like I have an idea for a video about Man of Steel that will sort of use that scene as a jumping off point to talk about, like, um, how the movie how a good Superman movie could still incorporate that scene and could still depict the Kents as having some concern and some ambivalence about Clark using his powers, right? But depict them in a way that doesn't make them into horrible libertarian, like objectivist monster people. Where you can do that without having, Jonathan being that much of a hard ass about Clark using his powers and sending the message that, you shouldn't use your powers to help people. You should look out for number one. And then going even further than that and having Martha actually tell Clark in a scene, "You don't owe this world a thing." Can you imagine Superman's parents telling Superman, "Clark, you don't owe this world a thing. You don't have to use your powers to help people. In fact, you probably shouldn't. To hell with the rest of the world, Clark." God, what? Who wants to see this story? God. Um. Anyway, I should answer Dottie Pie's question. If I were Superman for one day, what would I do? Oh boy, kill so many people. Just like heat vision some people from orbit. Untraceable. Take so many people out. You know? Take so many people out. No, I would try to do good. I would try to do things. You know what I would do if I were Superman for only one day? I don't know if I could accomplish it all in one day because that's a big job, but maybe with super speed and, X-ray vision and everything, if I really set my mind to it, I would love to try and do the Superman 4. I would love to try and get rid of all the nuclear weapons. Get rid of all the nuclear weapons and destroy, like, all the nuclear production facilities, like completely destroy the nuclear arsenals of every country on the planet and destroy the capability to make nuclear weapons so that there would at least be a few years where there wouldn't be any nukes. And maybe, after I destroyed all the nukes and then I went on TV right as I was losing my superpowers and said, "Hey, I've had superpowers for the last 24 hours. And what I did was I destroyed all the nukes in the world. So there's no more nukes. So maybe, you should all tell your governments and your political leaders that you don't want them to make any more. Like, let's just kind of keep this going since we got rid of the nukes. I don't know, just a suggestion. Anyway, I'm not Superman anymore, but I just thought I would help out. Something like that. Yeah, I would get rid of all the. I would try to get rid of all the nukes. Yeah. Radical bacon, that would piss off us nuclear reactor operators. I guess I could leave nuclear power alone, right? But I would get rid of all the nuclear weapons. Leave the nuclear power plants, you know. But strongly encourage transitions to safer versions to safer power sources. What Dottie, that would be tempting, but like I don't know. Yes, throughout the trick, I would have to make sure to get rid of all the nuclear weapons without inadvertently creating Nuclear Man for sure. Yeah. It would be tempting, Dottie, to leave Earth and go see space for 24 hours, but that would be selfish. If I only had 24 hours and I spent them flying around in space and like sightseeing in space, that would be selfish. And if I were truly trying to be Superman, Superman would not do the selfish thing. Superman would do the altruistic thing because Superman is a good, kind person. And he wants to help. Then Geraldo Trekkie says, in a better movie, that scene would be the moment that inspired Clark to do the heroics. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I feel like there is a way to frame that scene where Jonathan's concern and Martha's concern is coming from a human, understandable place, right? Where they're not. It's not the right thing. Like I feel like Clark Superman is a person who is the inheritor of a great deal of privilege, because of his powers. He's in a very privileged position, and I don't think it's ever right to say to a privileged person, you do not need to use your privilege to help people. You don't owe it to society to try to give back or to try to use your platform to help people who are less fortunate. I feel like that's always bad advice. But if it's a situation where, using your platform, using your privileges, using your superpowers in the case of Superman could put you at some kind of risk, I think it's understandable for a parent, for a loved one, in a moment of concern for their loved one to say, like, be careful and don't risk your neck for a world that won't appreciate you. Like, I think that comes from an understandable place. I think it's terrible advice, but I think you can frame it as coming from a place of fear and coming from a place of concern for your child, as opposed to the way it came across in those movies where it just seems like they're just shitty people. They're just shitty, selfish people, and they are raising their son to be a shitty, selfish person too. Which is how he acts most of the time. Even though they occasionally pay lip service to, oh, he's a hero, he's Superman, he inspires people. You never actually see, in the Zack Snyder movies, you never actually see him acting that way. He never acts like Superman. Occasionally people talk about him as though he is some heroic, inspiring version of Superman, but we never actually see him doing that. Whenever we see him, he's a sullen, self-pitying, put-upon asshole who seems like he'd rather be doing anything but using his powers to help people. Oh, and Dana, that's a good. Dana says my Martha would tell him that, meaning tell him you don't owe the world a thing, because she wouldn't want him to do it out of a sense of obligation, but out of a free choice, because he's a good, kind person. See, that's a lot better. That's a lot better. Much different, would require a much different delivery than Diane Lane gave it in the movie, though, when she's like, Clark, you don't owe this world a thing. You're a bad mom. Martha. You're a bad mom. You don't tell a superpowered person that. You don't know this world a thing, person with superpowers who could help countless people. You're a bad mom. Um, yeah, Geralta Trekkie. Yeah, clips of Soups doing the heroics and yelled, "Hey, smile! You're saving people. Stop being miserable." Well, not only that, but like you almost never see him saving people either. Like it's not just that he saves people and he doesn't smile. He hardly ever saves anybody in the Zack Snyder movies, other than Lois and his mom. Like he saves people who are his personal friends, but just sort of the general public, you never see scenes of Superman saving somebody. Like the scene I was just praising from Superman and Lois, where he stops the car from hitting the kid. That's just a random kid. He's nobody to Superman. He's just a random kid who was going to get smashed by a car. Superman grabs the car, sets the car down, gives the kid the hat back, says, "Hey, my pleasure. I'm Superman. That's what I do." Because he's a hero, because that's what heroes do. They help people, they save people. If they're on hand when there's about to be some kind of a disaster and they can do something to stop it or to help people affected by it, that's what they do. And when you show us in the audience that that's what they do, then it comes across. If all you ever show us of the hero is them getting into fistfights with people that cause massive amounts of collateral damage that presumably lead to the deaths of thousands of people, you know, um, but then occasionally you tell us, "Oh, he's a great hero. The world loves him." Like that doesn't come across. That feels false because we never see him doing anything that's inspiring. We just see him causing destruction and pissing and moaning about having to be a hero, you know? So random geek. That's an interesting point when you say it was never a question if Superman does good in Man of Steel because we see him rescue the oil workers, so there was no tension. Well, the thing that I always, yeah, he does, he saves the oil workers in that scene, but I think I mentioned this in my one of my first reviews of the movie when I first saw it, was that it's once he actually becomes Superman, and I mean actually puts on the suit, it's like he becomes less heroic, because when he saves the oil workers, he's not Superman yet. He doesn't have the suit. He's just sort of Clark, just kind of drifting around. And the oil rig disaster happens, and he just sort of helps out there, and saves people. But when he actually becomes Superman and puts on the cape, it's like he becomes less heroic. We don't see him save anybody after that. Like, what the hell? Radical Bacon, I think, yes, I think Superman does need to eat. I again, going back to and I don't overthink it. I don't get into like, well, but someone with his metabolism or someone with his molecular density, they'd have to eat, so much more food than a regular. I don't overthink it to that extent. I go back to Superman talking to Lois in their first interview in Superman the movie, in the Christopher Reeve movie, where Lois says, "Do you eat?" and Superman says, "Yes, when I'm hungry." That's all I need to know. Um, Alta Trekkie, I watched some of that. The Nostalgia Critic Angry Joe review. I watched some of it, but I mean, I don't really like either guy, so I don't really remember it. I think I watched a few minutes of it, and I was like, okay, because like I think it was one of those things where like even the stuff they agreed on was stuff about the movie that I hated. Like I think what was it? One of them didn't like the movie and one of them liked the movie, but there was like an action scene. They both really, really like geeked out about the action scenes in Man of Steel, which I thought were just terrible. I thought the action in Man of Steel was just garbage. I thought it was tedious. I thought it was, you know, really badly staged, went on way too long, was way too, did a disservice to the character because it showed him just being completely reckless and not having any concern for collateral damage or civilian casualties or anything. So I did not like the action in Man of Steel at all, and that was like one of the things about the movie that I think they both agreed. They're like, "Oh yeah, of course the action scenes were awesome." Okay, I guess if that's your thing, whatever. Um, Radical Bacon, is Superman heavier than us meaty water flesh? That's another thing where I feel like I feel like that's another area where I just don't overthink it. I don't think he's heavier than us. No. I mean, I know there's like the issue of, well, a common explanation for his powers is his molecules are a lot denser than ours because he's a Kryptonian and that's where he gets his strength and everything from. And you would think that, if greater density would mean that he weighs more than us. But that is something I am completely happy. I mean, obviously, and maybe if Dana has a different take, then we'll have to figure it out, and argue about it for our fic. But to me personally, that's something I am totally happy to hand wave and say, yeah, he has higher molecular density, but no, he doesn't weigh any more than anybody else because Superman, you know. Um, Submarine, I try not to overthink any of it. If I catch myself overthinking it, I try to pull back and go, don't overthink it. I try not to overthink any of it. Yeah, Dana, that's how it'll go. Dana will just yell at me until I say, fine, we'll do it your way. Yeah, well, see, Duralta Trekkie, that's another one of my pet peeves. Speaking of overthinking things, this is something about Superman that has been overthought for probably about 30 or 40 years, right? And actually, we can kind of blame the Christopher Reeve Superman movies for this, I think, although I don't think it was intentionally done. They didn't know that they were starting some shit, but I think okay, so here's the thing. Okay, maybe not. Maybe it goes back to the comics, but it's something that I feel like is an overthinking of the character that really is a pet peeve of mine. Duralta Trekkie says there's one funny line in the Man of Steel movie. That's not an S, that's the symbol of hope. And then Lois responds, well, here it's an S, right? In my perfect world, it's an S, and that's all it is. It's not a Kryptonian letter. It's not a symbol for anything. It's not a symbol for hope. It's not a symbol for what. It's an S, and it stands for Superman, and that's it. And when he gets into his, when it's like the stylized Delta shield and it's an S. It's an S. It's an S. It's an S. It's not a Kryptonian symbol. It's an S. And I feel like that you're getting too cutesy with it when you're like, no, it looks like an S, but actually it's the crest of the House of L, or it's the symbol for hope, or no, no. It's like in the Solo movie, right? The Han Solo movie, where they came up with some bullshit explanation for why his last name is Solo. It's like, do we need an origin story for his name? Can't it just be his name? He's Superman. He has an S on his chest. It's an S. Yeah. Hi, Dottie Pie. Yeah, Dana, like he didn't notice that it looked like an S. Yeah, like somebody points that out to him when he's like in his 30s. And he's like, "Oh, I'll be damned. It does look like an S, doesn't it? Oh shit. How about that?" I mean, come on. Yeah, yeah, actually in our universe, our version of Clark, his middle name is Jerome. Yes. His middle name, although it has been Joseph in the comics and in other versions. It's been either Joseph or Jerome most of the time when his when his middle name is given in stories. It's usually either Joseph or Jerome. And Dana and I have decided that in our version, our Superman's middle name is Jerome. Yes. Yeah, Sermon Greek. I mean, it's not overthinking characters isn't it's not the worst thing. I mean, it's not always a bad thing, but I find I try not to get too trapped in my head. You know what I mean? Like, and I usually, not always, but usually when I find myself overthinking something, especially overthinking like a relatively minor thing, it turns out to be something that's not important, that is a distraction. You know what I mean? Hi, Emily. Um, it turns out to be something that's distracting me from what the story is actually about, or something important to the character. So I mean, that's not always the case. You can overthink things that do turn out to be important, but in my experience, it's usually getting distracted by something that turns out to be trivial, and I should just be like, fuck it, it's this, it'll be this, and that's not what the story is about, and I should be focusing my energies on something else. You know, um, that's one of the, it's also one of the reasons. Yeah, it's because he was always looking at it upside down. Exactly. Somebody said, that looks like an S, and he's like, oh shit, oh man, I didn't even notice. And then of course, when he sees it in the mirror, it's reversed. So yeah, Dana, it is Yes, it is procrastination. A lot of times, you get distracted by something. You're like, I'm going to focus on this because I don't want to actually, I don't actually have to write the rest of the story yet. So I'm gonna get distracted by this. I think that's really really accurate. Yeah. Yeah. So well, it's probably it's related to it's not wanting to overthink things combined with my general feeling that backstory should remain backstory is why I'm not terribly interested in Krypton. You know, like to me, Krypton is backstory for Superman. Like Krypton is the reason that he has superpowers, and that's all I need it for. You know what I mean? Like I've gotten really, I mean, really, when we've talked about Superman before, when I've done videos about Superman, or I think Dana and I discussed Superman a little bit in one of the comment response videos we've done that I put up over the last few weeks. And we get really really nice comments from people who are like, oh, I love Superman, and I would love to have a story where it explores like the history of Krypton or the culture of Krypton or whatever. And I know there are a lot of fans that are interested in that, and good for them, more power to you if that's what you're interested in, but I could not care less. Like I could not care less about anything that ever happened on Krypton other than Jor-El and Lara put Kal-El into a ship and launched it into space, and then the planet blew up. That's literally all I need to know about Krypton. I don't care about the history of his family. I don't care about Kryptonian society. I don't care about government. I don't care about history. I don't care about anything to do with Krypton. All I need to know is how come he can fly? How come he's so fast? How come he's so strong? How come bullets bounce off him? How come he has heat vision and X-ray vision? Oh, he's an alien from another planet. What's he doing here? Oh, his planet blew up. His parents put him on a ship and shot him into space before the planet blew up. Okay, good. That's all I need. Krypton is backstory to me. Like I don't care about it. But if you do, that's great. But as especially as a writer, when I'm thinking about Superman stories for fanfic and stuff, like I could not care less about anything to do with Krypton. Um, yeah, some random geek, exactly. Marlon Brando's, and look, I mean, the Krypton stuff in Superman the movie is not terrible, but yeah, I mean, if they weren't trying to justify Marlon Brando's presence in the movie, like if they didn't need to have Brando in it more, there's no reason for any of that Krypton. So you could summarize the Krypton stuff very very quickly. You don't really need. I mean, the first 20 minutes or so of the movie is Krypton stuff, and you just don't. And Man of Steel is even worse. Man of Steel, it's like the Krypton stuff takes up like the first 40 minutes or something of the movie, and it's ridiculous. Like, who gives a shit about any of this? This planet is going to blow up. These people are going to be dead. Who gives a shit about any of this? And a lot of a lot of the exposition that you get during the Krypton scenes in Man of Steel is repeated when Clark finds the ship that sort of becomes his version of the Fortress of Solitude, and he sees the hologram of Jor-El, and we get the exposition of what we already watched in the Krypton stuff at the beginning of the movie. So you could just cut that completely out. We don't need any of that. He learns that later, and we could learn it at the same time. And it would be like a reveal instead of us having to sit through it twice, you know? Um, then they could have done something similar in Superman the movie, and they could have still had Brando in it because Brando does appear as Jor-El in the fortress, sort of the hologram of him when he's talking to Clark. You know, but they paid Brando a bunch of money and they gave him top billing, and they figured, well, people are going to expect to see Brando in the movie. So, they have a somewhat lengthy Krypton prologue that, yeah, I love that movie. Like, I love that movie. But sure, I could do without the Krypton stuff. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I mean, the only way I could say it was absolutely necessary would be that it does set up the General Zod stuff for Superman 2. But you could probably set that up without actually having to have lengthy scenes set on Krypton either, you know? Beautifulest one asks, what does Clark find attractive about Lois? Is she as determined as his mother or as fair-minded as his father? What is it that draws him to her? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to connect to his mom or his dad. I mean, I have found people attractive, fallen in love with people in my life that didn't remind me of either of my parents. I don't think it's necessarily that she connects to his mom or his dad. I think there's a lot about Lois that I think could generally be considered attractive. I mean, I think she's incredibly smart. She's determined. She's courageous. She's socially conscious in most versions of the character. Like, she's a pretty progressively minded person. She's talented. She's an award-winning journalist. She's tenacious. She's the versions of Lois that I have really enjoyed the most, like the Margot Kidder Lois from the Chris Reeve movies. Like a smart aleck, really witty and funny, kind of acerbic. She's just a really, really appealing character in a lot of different ways. And it doesn't, I look at like the Margot Kidder version of Lois, or the Phyllis Coates version of Lois from the first season of Adventures of Superman, which is probably my second favorite live action Lois. And they're just really, really appealing, attractive women. Not just, I mean, they're physically attractive too, because they're played by actresses on, TV shows and movies. So of course they're gorgeous, but they're just really interesting, intelligent, vibrant, living people. Like, why wouldn't you, if you're the kind of person who's into women, like, why wouldn't you fall in love with Lois? She's awesome. She's awesome. Sure, beautiful as one. I hope that was a good answer. Um, yeah, Robert Mill says you could have Clark mention Zod, and then a hologram comes up of his court. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways you could do the exposition without having to have like a lengthy Krypton scene. And honestly, I think it's more interesting. It's one of the reasons why I didn't really like the way they did it in Man of Steel. I think whenever you can, as a writer, if you can craft it as a reveal, where the character is learning something and you are learning something at the same time as the character, I think that's always a way to go. Like, it's I don't think it's generally good practice to have, and there are exceptions to this, obviously, but generally speaking, I don't think it's good practice to have the audience learn something before the character knows it. There are times when it's good to do that. You know, you can do that. You can use that to create suspense and create tension. But when it's something like, you know, their origins, like Superman discovering where he came from, which is a little different because like everybody knows the story, generally speaking, but within the confines of the movie, we as the audience should not be learning about Krypton, I don't think, before Clark does. You know, like I think the first time Krypton gets mentioned in the story should be the first time Clark hears about it. We shouldn't be getting Krypton stuff before Clark knows it because Clark is in most takes on the character, Clark, Superman, is the protagonist. He's the central character. We're following him. So as we follow him, we should learn things as he learns them. And you know, that's how I see it for me and Dana's universe. I have an idea for how Clark learns about Krypton. I will say, and it becomes a little clearer in the second half of the story when I read the second half of the story next week. We're at the point in Superman's career in our version where Clark, he does not know about Krypton yet. Um, and I have explanations in mind for how everything works out, but how you know how he can be Superman and not know about Krypton, but he doesn't know about Krypton yet. And I have in my head, I haven't written the story yet, obviously. I haven't even really planned out the story, but I have an idea for how he learns that. But until he learns that, you know, like there's not going to be Krypton stuff in my Superman stories until Superman learns it. Because I just don't, you know, why would I tell the audience something that I'm only going to have to tell them again when Clark figures it out or when Clark hears about it, you know? Um, Yeah, Radical Bacon, that's a good question. I like Dana's answer. Radical Bacon says, "Why does Superman want to be a journalist?" And Dana says, "To speak truth to power." The I think our take on the character, and I can speak for myself, and Dana, please jump in if you disagree with me here, or if there's something else. But like, um, the more modern versions of the character, the sort of post crisis versions of the character, have written it that Clark wanted to be a journalist because he wanted to be a journalist, you know, because he was interested in learning and learning about the world and in being a journalist and yet speaking truth to power, telling people the news, you know, informing the public, being a writer, right? Like that was just something that he wanted to do with his life. That was a career that he wanted. Obviously, you know, in the old days, the classic explanation was, well, Superman became a reporter because that way he had access to the news, you know, before the general public got to hear it, and he could learn where his abilities were needed. And you know, he would hear about a natural disaster through the news wire at the newspaper before it was published or before it was on the radio, and Superman would be able to fly off and do something about it. You know, so it was a practical thing. But in today's day and age, that's not really as much of an issue. We have more access to information. So Clark doesn't become a reporter for any sort of practical purpose to help in his career as Superman. He becomes a reporter because he wants to be a reporter, because that's what he's interested in. Oh, thank you, Steve George. I'm very glad you dropped. I'm going to wrap this up here pretty soon. Um, uh, but 'cause I've been going for it was like the reading of the story took about 40 minutes, and now we're at over an hour. I've been going for an hour past reading the story, which is great. Like I love hanging out with you all and answering questions and stuff and talking Superman. But I'm going to wrap it up here in the next few minutes. But Deralta Trekkie asks, how do you like the Crisis on Infinite Earths comic compared to the 5-hour special of the Arrowverse? Um, I kind of prefer the Arrowverse version. I respect the Crisis comic as a historic comic book, you know, and for its sort of its place in the history of DC Comics. I think it's a milestone, obviously, but as a story, it's I mean it's not bad, but you know it's there to it's there to do a job. It's there like most of those big crossovers. It's very functional. You know, it accomplishes what it wants to accomplish. Um, but as drama, as literature, like there's not really much to speak of. I mean, most big major crossovers like that are not all that great in terms of pieces of writing. It's fine, you know. But the Arrowverse the TV version I thought was pretty good, and you know, certainly again I can't help but compare it to the big screen versions, you know, and it's just I mean I got for God's sake I got to see my Tyler Hoechlin Superman, and I got to see Brandon Routh come back as Superman, which I never thought I'd get to see. So the TV I prefer the TV version. But yeah, I have respect for the comic version, although it's not as a story. I don't think it's anything super special. Um, Jordan Joan P says, "How do you feel about Superman and Lois having kids in the CW show? Slows down the story of Superman and Lois, or makes them more interesting?" I think it's a really interesting way to go because we've never really seen that before. I think there's a lot of potential there. And it's not spoiling anything. Like the premise of the show is that Clark and Lois have twin sons who are teenagers who are just starting as freshmen in high school as the show begins. That's the premise of the series, and I think it's really interesting. I'm completely on board with it. I think it's a great angle. I like that they're trying. It seems like they're trying to do not just another Superman show. They want to do a Superman show, but they want their show to have a unique approach, you know, and Clark and Lois as parents of possibly superpowered teenagers, possibly, is really interesting, I think. And is you know, we've never really seen a sustained version of Superman where we got to see him as a dad, you know, and Lois as a mom, you know, to get to see them as parents. Like I think that's a really interesting way to go. So I'm on board with it 100%. Geraldo Treggy says, "While we're at the comics, do you think that in a possible fourth season of the Superman show, we should get the death and return of Superman storyline?" I mean, I don't think that's necessary. I mean, I know that that's sort of, you know, people, I guess people, especially people who remember that story from the comics in the 90s, who remember the, you know, the first Doomsday story and the reign of the Superman and all that, you kind of expect that. But I don't really think it's necessary. I mean, I think you can do a Superman TV show and not have to riff on that. I mean, if they want to and they have like a really good idea for it, and they say, "Hey, if we did the death and return of Superman on our show, we could do this, this, and this, and it would be a really great story." Well, then yeah, let's go for it. But to just do it for the sake of doing it because it's like, well, it's Superman. Eventually, we're going to have to do the death. I don't think so. I don't think you have to. You know. So I mean, maybe I don't know. I would. It would just be nice if we get 4 seasons of the show, and it's good. You know. Um, Anyway, so yeah, I'm gonna wrap up now. Some Random Geek, thank you very much for reminding me about the charity links. Some friends, Some Random Geek is very very kind to put together a Google Doc that has a collection of PayPal links and GoFundmes and stuff like that that help out some friends of ours who need some financial assistance, who are sort of falling on hard times. And if you could possibly see your way clear to going to that page, it's charitylinks.page. It's linked in the description of the video, and helping out some of our friends with a few bucks here and there. That would be just tremendous. I would highly encourage you to do that. And thank you very much if you do. And thanks, as always, to Some Random Geek for curating that and keeping that up. Yeah, other than that, patreon.com/Steve Shives to support my channel. If you want to help me out and help me continue to do this YouTube thing that I do. Don't forget that tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, Dana and I will be back for the next chapter of The Dispossessed for our Read Away series. We will be discussing what happens in chapter 9 of The Dispossessed. And then on Monday, I will be back with another conversation stream. My guest will be Allison Pregler. We will be talking about Baywatch primarily. Of course, Allison, one of the popular series on her YouTube channel is called Baywatching, where she summarizes and makes fun of episodes of Baywatch. So we're going to talk about Baywatch. We might talk about a little Star Trek too, because she also did that video about the Inner Light and why she doesn't like the Inner Light, which is usually one of the more beloved episodes of TNG. Allison has some very different thoughts about it, so we might talk about that a little bit too, but primarily a Baywatch discussion. And then Wednesday, Dana and I will be back for another Trek Reluctantly. We'll be watching Firefly, the episode Out of Gas. And then a week from tonight will be part 2 of my Superman story that I read the first part of earlier tonight. So please come back to hear part 2 to hear the thrilling conclusion of my Superman story. And then a week from Friday will be myself and Dana and the one and only Jason Harding for the season 3 Q&A live stream of the Ensign's Log. So a whole bunch of really cool shit happening on the channel here in the next week or so. So I hope you can join me for some or all of it. And that's just live streams. Like there's other stuff happening too. I think I'm going to have another funny video go up on Monday, and next Wednesday is going to be a where do we go from here? It'll be about immigration reform. I'm writing it now. So all kinds of stuff coming up in the next week or so on the channel. So, but make sure you're back here next Thursday at 6 Eastern for part 2 of this Superman fanfic of Superman Two Figures on a Riverbank, as I'm calling it. Anyway, thank you all so much for listening to me read my story. Thank you for hanging out and asking questions and chatting with me about Superman and comics and stuff. It was awesome. Hope you all have a really good night and a really good weekend. And I will hopefully see some of you tomorrow for Read Away and for the other live streams. And whenever I see you, until then, be safe, be well, take care, everybody. Thanks for watching.